4.5. We are dealing with quadratic equations. So we still have that same like x squared with an x and a number, but now we have an equal to sign, so it makes it an equation. Before we just had quadratic expressions, now we have equations. So what we are doing is essentially finding the zero of the function. So before we would factor this into our two parentheses. Let's say that this parentheses, the first one, was a number, any number, and this one was 0. What's any number times 0? 0. So if one of them's a 0, that makes the whole thing a 0. If this one was 0, or if this one was a number and this one was 0, what's 0 times a number? 0. So only one of our parentheses has to be 0 for this to work. So it'll make more sense when we actually do the examples. But we only need one to be 0 because that would make our whole equation 0. So we factor it just like we did before, and then just set both of them equal to 0, and we're going to get two different answers. So how do we factor this? What are our two factors of 6 that add to negative 5?
Negative 3 and 2.
Negative 3 and negative 2. So we put those into our parentheses. We have x minus 3 and x minus 2 is equal to 0. Now either one of these can be 0 for our equation to work, so we're going to set x minus 3 is equal to 0 and x minus 2 is equal to 0. So we just break them up into two separate little equations. And then we solve for x. So how do we solve for x in our first equation? Add 3.
Plus 3.
So x is equal to 3. And what do we do in our second equation? Add 2. So what's x equal to? 2. So our two answers are x is equal to 3 and x is equal to 2. That's all we have to do. So it's really just like one step more than what we've been doing. So we have to factor it. So what we've been doing is getting it to here, factor it. Now we just break it up into two little equations and find what x is equal to.
I'm lost.
If we plug in 2 into here, what's x minus 2? 0.
What?
So if we take 2, which was one of the answers we found, and plug it back into x in our equation, we get x minus 2, or 2 minus 2, which is 0. So then that would make our equation 0, which is true. We would do the same thing for 3. If we take 3, plug it in here, 3 minus 3 is 0. So then that makes sense too. So for all of these, we're always going to have two answers. So these are our two answers. All right. Sometimes the equation's not set up the way we want it to. We always, always, always want it to be equal to 0 and then factor. So what do we need to do to get all of our terms on one side and this to be equal to 0? If 12 is if it's negative on the right side, how do we move it to the left? Add 12. So we add 12 to the other side, so we get x squared minus 7x plus 12 is equal to, what's negative 12 plus 12? 0. So all we did was move our 12 over to the other side because we have to have our equation equal to 0. So now let's go ahead and factor. What are two factors of 12 that add to negative 7? Negative 3 and negative 4. Perfect, those work. So we put them into our parentheses. X minus 3 times x minus 4 is equal to 0. Now from here, we split it up into two separate equations. We have x minus 3 is equal to 0, and x minus 4 is equal to 0. Yes, you have to show your work. So to solve for x in our first equation on the left side, what do? Add 3. So x is equal to what? And then in the second equation, what do? Add 4. So x is equal to 4. We got x is equal to 3 as an answer, and x is equal to 4. All right, so here we have equal to 0, so we can go ahead and factor. We don't have to do anything to start. So what are two factors of negative 24 that add to 2? Negative 4 and what's negative 4 times 2? Negative 4 and 6. 6 times negative 4 is negative 24, and 6 minus 4 is 2. Perfect. So we plug those into our parentheses. We have x plus 6, x minus 4. What do we do next? Perfect. We set them both equal to 0. So x plus 6 is equal to 0, and x minus 4 is equal to 0. So we solve for x now. What do we do in our equation on the left? Subtract 6 to move it over. So x is equal to negative 6. And what about the equation on the right? Add 4. So x is equal to 4. So these are our two answers. We only have two terms here. If x is a perfect square, or x squared is a perfect square, and 9 is a perfect square, what do? Remember, we have a squared is equal to x squared. So what's a equal to? X. And b squared is equal to 9, so it's b equal to 3. So since we only have two terms, we plug it into the one with two parentheses. So this is the one where we have a plus b and a minus b. So x plus 3 and x minus 3. So we factored it. Now what do? Split it. So we have x plus 3 is equal to 0. X minus 3 is equal to 0. How do we solve our x plus 3 is equal to 0 equation? Subtract 3. So what do you get for x? Negative 3. And then what do we do in the second equation? Add 3. X is equal to 3. So we got our two answers. Any questions? Another way we could factor this one is if we had x squared minus 9 is equal to 0. We don't have a middle term, so we could say, what are two factors of negative 9 that add to 0? So what two numbers multiply to negative 9 and add to 0? 3 and? What's 3 plus 3? 6. 3 times 3 is positive 9, but we need it to be a negative 9. So 3 and negative 3. So then we just plug it into our parentheses. We have x plus 3 and x minus 3. So if you like to do it this way works too. You can solve it like this. So since we don't have a middle term, we would just say, what are two factors of negative 9 that add to 0? And that would be 3 and negative 3. And we would get the same answer as before. So it's just a different way of factoring. If it's easier to see it this way, factor it this way. X plus 36 is equal to 0. So what should we do next?
The factors of 36.
Factors of 36 that add to 13. What would they be?
9 and 4.
Awesome, 9 and 4. Perfect. So we have x plus 9 and x plus 4. What should we do next? Separate them. So x plus 9 is equal to 0. X plus 4 is equal to 0. How do we solve x plus 9 is equal to 0? Subtract 9. So what do we get for x? Negative 9. And what do we do in the next equation? Subtract 4, and we get x is equal to negative 4. Awesome. Good work, guys. Not too tricky? It's just one more step than what we've been doing with factoring. So you just have to split up your two little equations and solve for x. So don't turn in the notes. All right, let's look at number 1. What should we do first? Subtract 4. We have to be equal to 0 to start. So we need to move that 4 to the other side. So we have to combine the 4 with the like term, which is 7. So it would be 7 minus 4. So we get x squared plus 4x. What's 7 minus 4? 3 is equal to 0. So now what are two factors of 3 that add to 4? 3 and 1. So we have x plus 3 and x plus 1 is equal to 0. What do we do next? Separate them. So we have x plus 3 is equal to 0 and x plus 1 is equal to 0. What do we get for x in our first equation? How do we move that 3 to the other side? Subtract it. So we get x is equal to negative 3. And what about the second equation? What do we get for x? X is equal to negative 1. You always need it to be equal to 0 in order to start factoring. So like for number 6, you would have to move it to the other side. For number 7, 8, 10, 12, 13, 14, and 15. So you have to get it equal to 0 before you start. Somebody in the audience asked to do 14, so we can do this one together too. What should I do first? We got to move the 5p over. So let's subtract 5p. So we get p squared okay, there we go. P squared minus 5p is equal to 0. Now we don't have 3 terms to factor here, but do we have any common factors that we can take out? What can we take out? P. So we're going to divide both of these by p. So we take out a p. What are we left with? In our first term, we started with 2 p's, but took one out. So we have p minus 5. Now, what do you think we do from here? What did we do when we got to this step in our other problems? Separate them. So we have p is equal to 0, and p minus 5 is equal to 0. For p is equal to 0, we don't even have to solve it. It's already solved for us. 0 is one of our answers. And then how do we solve p minus 5 is equal to 0? Add 5. So p is equal to 5. So these are our two answers here.